Good afternoon, and welcome to my lecture for Philosophy 3200 on the perils of disobedience. My previous lecture was about the perils of obedience, talking about the views of Stanley Milgram. And for this one, I wanted to look for somebody who had kind of an opposite view. Somebody who maybe thinks that obedience to authority is not so dangerous and that disobedience to authority is the greater danger. Perhaps somebody who thinks that obeying your own conscience is dangerous. Is there anybody who thinks that? And yes, as a matter of fact, there is. This is what I found. This is Robert Bork. Robert Bork was a famous conservative judge who died in 2012. He was at one point nominated for the Supreme Court by President Reagan, but he was denied confirmation, partly due to his controversial views. And he wrote this article for the conservative Christian magazine First Things, in which he talks about the dangers of people following their own conscience instead of following the dictates of authority figures. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about Bork's views, and I'm going to intersperse my own opinions about his arguments. The title of Bork's article is Thomas More for Our Season. And this is a reference to Sir Thomas More, who was a famous English lawyer and philosopher in the 1500s who, you might say, got in trouble with the king. Basically what happened was King Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce, and the Catholic Church wouldn't let him do that, and so the king decided that he was supreme over the church. In fact, this was the origin of the Anglican Church. They started a whole new religion so that he could get a divorce. Now, King Henry VIII wanted people to swear allegiance, and in particular, he wanted Thomas More to take an oath saying that he, Thomas More, agreed that the king was supreme over the church. Thomas More refused to do this because he did not agree with that, and he thought that the church was supreme, and therefore the king cut off his head. Now, this incident is the subject for a famous play called A Man for All Seasons, and so that's where Bork got his title, Thomas More for Our Season. Thomas More is sometimes viewed as kind of a hero for civil disobedience, but Robert Bork tries to recruit him rather as a hero for obedience to authority and the law. And Bork's argument is Thomas More didn't do what he did. He didn't disobey the king because he was following his own conscience. He disobeyed the king only because he believed in a higher authority, namely the church. So he was obeying the church rather than his own conscience, rather than the king. This is Bork's general view. He thinks that disobedience to authority can only be justified when, quote, the issue is of transcendent importance and you are absolutely sure of the right and wrong of the matter. So that's from page 20 of his article. You might notice that these are very strong conditions. Indeed, the condition that you should be absolutely sure, you might wonder whether that condition has ever been satisfied. So you might wonder whether Bork would actually ever say that disobedience was justified. Presumably he put that in there because he thinks at least sometimes this has happened, but it must be very rare. Okay, why does he think this? So I could find a couple of arguments in the article. So this is my interpretation of the argument. I think there's a suggestion of an argument based on fallibility. The argument is that you don't know what is right and wrong. You should recognize your own fallibility, but you do know what the law is, and therefore it makes more sense to decide what to do based upon what the law says rather than based upon what you think is right and wrong. And Bork quotes this line approvingly from A Man for All Seasons. So in the play, I don't know if the real Thomas More would have said this, but in the play, the character Thomas More says, I know what's legal, not what's right, and I'll stick with what's legal. I'm not God. So Bork quotes this approvingly, presumably suggesting that only God would have sufficient knowledge to be able to justifiably defy the law, right, or at least in normal circumstances. Now, what do we think about this argument? These are my own comments about that argument. I'm not sure whether Bork meant that we never know what's right and wrong. If he thinks that we never know what's right and wrong, then it would follow that we don't know whether it's right or wrong to obey the authority figures either. It would also follow that the legislators who made the law don't know what's right and wrong either. If they don't know what's right and wrong, then what reason do we have for obeying their dictates? Bork also assumes that we unproblematically know what the law requires. And while this may be true in most cases, it's not completely unproblematic. The law is frequently rather complicated. It can be ambiguous and just confusing. In some cases, you have to hire an expert to explain to you what the law requires. And there are even cases in which the experts will disagree about what the law requires. Anyway, suppose that it's true that you know what the law requires, but you don't know what's right and wrong. Is that actually a reason for obeying the law? I mean, there are a lot of things that we know, but that doesn't mean that we should do them. Right, so, just because you know what Kim Kardashian says people should do, that doesn't mean that you should do that. And so similarly, just because you know what the law says, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do that thing. Now, the best that I can make of it is Bork is assuming that the audience already agrees that there's some fairly strong reason for obeying the law. He's just assuming that you think that. And then he's confronting the possibility that you might think that there was a countervailing reason for not obeying the law, which would be, it conflicts with your conscience. And so he's trying to undermine what you might think was this countervailing reason by saying, well, you really shouldn't be confident in your own moral judgment. Okay, now this is connected to the other major argument that I can find in Bork's article, and this is the appeal to the importance of order. Because the first premise of this argument is that individual conscience is highly variable. This might be the reason why he thinks that you don't know what's right and wrong. That is simply because there's quite a lot of disagreement among individuals about what is right and wrong. Now, there's not disagreement about everything. There are a lot of things that people agree about, like people agree that you shouldn't murder other people. But there are a lot of disagreements about things like whether abortion counts as murder, or whether recreational drug use is wrong, or whether gay marriage should be allowed, etc. And you could give lots of examples. And in many of these cases, you have a division among society that's about half and half. About half of society thinks that abortion is something close to murder, and about half of society thinks it's not wrong at all. And with such disagreement, it looks like we need some way of kind of resolving or deciding what we're going to do that's predictable and uniform. Now, the law is uniform because it's just written down, and it doesn't change very often. Now, Bork's view is, and the conservatives' view generally, is that it's very important to have social order and not have chaos. Why is it important to have this uniform law rather than everybody following their own conscience? One reason is predictability. People need to know what to expect in order to plan their lives. You have to know what sorts of behavior are going to be considered acceptable on your part. You need to know what you're going to be allowed to do and how society is going to react to your behavior in order to plan. You also need to have an idea of how other people are going to behave. And in order to have this, you need some kind of uniform set of rules that you can pretty well count on people following. If everybody is following their own conscience and there are wide disagreements about what is morally right, then you're just not going to be able to predict. You won't be able to predict other people's behavior, and when you're planning your own behavior, you won't necessarily be able to predict other people's reactions. You don't know whether you're going to be punished for what you do or not. The other problem is there's a potential for social conflict because of these disagreements. So if you have some people who think that abortion is horribly wrong and other people who think that it's every woman's right to have an abortion, then there's a potential that these people will just wind up fighting with each other, and that could be very destructive. The social conflict could be more destructive even than making the wrong decision on one of these controversial issues. You could have people, fighting with each other in the streets, even killing each other. In order to avoid social conflict, we need to have this kind of uniform rule for society, and we need people to be willing to defer to that rule. So the conclusion here is you should act according to the law rather than according to your individual conscience. The idea is kind of like you should do your part in making for social order to resolve the conflict and create predictability. This is a quotation from Bork. He says, "It is a symptom of our disorder that we glorify, practically deify, the individual conscience." And so there he is actually explicitly saying that you should not follow your conscience. You should instead follow the rules of society, and particularly the laws that have been established by the state. Now, these are my own comments on this. These are counterpoints that you might make to this argument. First, it seems to me that uniform injustice is not better than a mix of justice and injustice. Sure, uniformity is good if you have something that's good in the first place. If X is good, then it's good for everyone to get it uniformly. But if X is bad, then it's not better for everyone to get it uniformly. It's better that only some people get it than everyone get it if it's something bad. Also, there are many exercises of conscience that actually do not create a risk of breaking down society. Now, that might be true in some small, unstable society. It might be that you're creating a risk of a breakdown of society. But in a very large, very stable society, disobeying the law is incredibly unlikely to result in social chaos and a breakdown of order. My suggestion is that you should give some amount of deference to the established social rules because of the reasons that Bork cites, but it should be deference within reason. In other words, you shouldn't just blindly defer to what the authorities say. And one of the problems is that if you have blind deference, if you have people who are disposed to follow the dictates of the authority figure regardless of whether they're moral or immoral, and regardless of what their own conscience tells them, this makes the authorities themselves less reliable. It encourages the authorities to abuse their power. If the authorities know that people are going to exercise their conscience and evaluate the commands that the authority figures are giving to see whether they're just or not, then the authority figures will be more careful to try to give just commands. But if people are just obeying blindly, then the authority figures know that they can just, without limit, abuse their power, and they can give unjust and immoral orders. And when they know that they can do that and expect people to follow them, then they're going to start doing that. So that's the problem that I see with Bork's argument here. These are other miscellaneous claims that he makes in the article. So he says that civil disobedience is selfish. Civil disobedience referring to the case where somebody explicitly disobeys the law because they have a kind of moral disagreement with it. This is Bork's comment. As Bickel noted, civil disobedience, no matter by whom or in what cause, is always a decision in favor of self, in favor of the idea of self. What he means there is something like you're placing your own judgment ahead of the judgment of the rest of society, and that's kind of selfish and arrogant. He also says it encourages moral relativism, and he warns that social order is breaking down. He cites the symptoms of the breakdown of social order: formless music, meaningless and offensive art, adolescent entertainment, subjective journalism, and an enthusiasm for genetic technology. Anarchy, it seems, is fast approaching. Now, Bork wrote this in 1999, but interestingly, you could say that today. It seems like we still have all of these signs of social order breaking down. These are some implications of Bork's general views about authority. So, as he was a judge, he had particular opinions about how the law should be interpreted. He was a big advocate of originalism. Now, what is originalism? So sometimes laws are ambiguous or incomplete. So there can be different ways of either interpreting the text or different ways of applying it to a particular circumstance when the law didn't explicitly anticipate that circumstance. So how should you interpret the law? There are different views that people have about this. There are some people who think that the judge should basically exercise their moral judgment and choose the interpretation that is kind of most morally sound. That's kind of basically the natural law view. Bork rejected that. He said that you shouldn't use your own individual conscience in accordance with the previous ideas on the previous slides. He thought that the judge should just rely on the original intentions of the framers of the law. Whoever wrote the law to begin with, just try to follow the purposes that that person had, or that those people had. He also commented on the idea of jury nullification. Jury nullification is a practice where a jury votes to acquit a defendant in a criminal trial despite clear evidence that the defendant violated the law. And in that sense, the jury, quote, nullifies the law, that is, renders it ineffectual. Why would they do this? So one reason is the jury might just disagree with the law morally. They might think it's an unjust or immoral law. Or alternately, they might think the law in general is fine, but they might think that in the present case there are extenuating circumstances. Or finally, it might be that they think the law is correct and that this person actually did something wrong. They might even think it deserves punishment, but they might think the magnitude of the punishment that's prescribed for that crime is too severe. Now, this is particularly likely to happen in a death penalty case. For example, you might have jurors who are morally opposed to the death penalty and just think that the defendant shouldn't get such a harsh punishment. They might think the defendant should be punished, but just not with that punishment. So they might even vote to acquit for that reason. Okay. These are some examples of jury nullification. So in the 19th century, trials under the fugitive slave laws would frequently result in acquittals despite the obvious guilt of the defendant due to widespread moral opposition to these laws. These were laws that required you basically to turn in escaped slaves. During the Prohibition era, trials for alcohol possession and sale would often result in acquittals due to widespread opposition to the Prohibition laws. During the 1990s, Dr. Jack Kevorkian got famous for assisting suicide for a number of terminally ill patients. And this was illegal in some of the states where he did this. And Jack Kevorkian, interestingly, got acquitted 3 times for assisted suicide, even though nobody doubted at all that he'd done it. And that was presumably because the jury disagreed with the law against assisted suicide. Drug trials today often result in hung juries, at least, due to widespread opposition to the nation's drug laws. And Robert Bork predictably considers all of this pernicious and, quote, lawless behavior. All right, so in conclusion, conservatives such as Robert Bork think that obedience to authority is very important because it preserves predictability and it avoids having social conflicts over the kinds of widespread moral disagreements that we can expect in our society. I was not myself completely persuaded by these arguments, but that's what they think.